Good evening, everyone. I think we're about ready to get started. Can we cut the music? We'll get started in a minute. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. It's kind of like competing with students and their phones in class and trying not to pay attention. Welcome to a new season of Café Historique. I'm so glad to see lots of familiar faces and some new faces too. Thank you so much for helping us kick off our season with a bang. As you know, this year's theme is the history of everyday life. And so we've got a great lineup of 6 talks for you. In November, we'll be following closely on the heels of the history of oil with the history of cars. And a little bit more on that in a second. And then in December, appropriately, as we roll into the holiday season, the history of drinking and alcohol. So we were trying to find the right date for her, and she's like, how about December? December seems like the right time. Definitely not, right after the holidays. And then in the spring, we'll be starting in February with the history of technology. The history of food follows in March, and the history of sport with a specific attention on the Olympic Games in April, which again is sort of appropriate as we roll into the Summer Olympics in Paris. So I hope you'll join us for all of those talks. Usually you'll get an email maybe a week or two after a talk, so about halfway between the 2 dates to encourage you to register for the next one. And so the next one should be coming out fairly soon. I have one announcement, and that is I personally found out tonight that I was misunderstanding how the parking works in the parkade. So many of you park in the parkade. I'm so sorry that it used to be practically free and it's no longer free, like most things these days. So it used to be that it was free after 6 and there was a first hour free. So we would all show up about 5:15, 5:30 and we were set. So now if you've noticed there's 1 hour free parking spots. And so I had been under the impression that it worked the same way, that you could show up to that 1 hour free parking spot and then maybe pay the balance or pay the rest. Not the case. So if you're parked in a 1 hour free parking spot, they do expect you to be like in and out in an hour. Apparently it's for shopping and other short visits. So please just think I would hate for anybody to get a parking ticket while they're here at the talk. So just park in a regular spot. And I'm sorry that it's expensive now. I'm frustrated along with you. So that concludes my announcements. And now I get to introduce our speaker. So my colleague, Martin Bunton, is actually a West Coast native from Vancouver originally. He did his BA at UBC. And then he went off to the hallowed halls of Oxford for his master's and his PhD. And then he did what many of us in the field call winning the lottery, which is getting a job back on the West Coast. Because anyone who grows up here wants to come back here, right? So he actually taught at UVic and also at Simon Fraser as a sessional for 3 or 4 years before landing the prize tenure track job at UVic. And he's been with us ever since 2002. So he's our specialist in the modern Middle East and works specifically on colonial land policy. So Martin is frequently a guest lecturer in some of my courses, which I teach European history, and I bring him in as a specialist to talk about what's going on in Eastern Europe around World War I. What's going on with the Ottoman Empire and how it's falling apart. And Martin did his PhD research, right? The land policy stuff is PhD research. Mm-hmm. He did his PhD research on the fact that the Ottomans, so modern-day Turks, were in fact changing land policies and really being innovative and doing interesting things with the way they organized the bureaucracy and the administration. And so Martin was one of the first people to say, we've been talking about the Ottoman Empire as this society in decline. We've been talking about how it was the sick old man of Europe and that it fell apart in 1919. He said, look at this vitality. Is this the sick old man of Europe? So really interesting thesis and something that ties into a lot of other themes in the area. His courses at UVic are super popular. He teaches the history of the Middle East. He teaches the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And he also teaches a new course in the history of the Arab Spring. His new publications are almost entirely textbooks because he's so sought after as an expert in this field. So we have the contemporary history of the Middle East. We have the history of the modern Middle East going into its 7th edition. Wish I could publish something that popular. And also recently with our colleague Andrew Wender, he co-authored The Middle East in World War I. So lots of exciting things going on, and I'm really, really happy that he was willing to come and open up our series talking about the history of oil with respect to the Middle East. So please give him a warm welcome for me.
Does that sound okay at the back? People can hear me okay? Great. And I'll stand here. I keep threatening Jill that one of these times I'll show up with a guitar and a harmonica. And then, because when else will I get a gig like this, right? And no. So let me start with the acknowledging that we're on the Lekwungen people's territory. I think we're going to talk a lot about resources and their relationship to social organizations. And so I think it's particularly appropriate to think about the damage that resource management has done here as well, and the disruptions to human society. And let me also start by thanking Jill, both for that very gracious introduction, but all you've done to keep his Café Historique going. So yeah, please join me. So both for your help tonight, but also for this. Now, oil. I'm actually going to blame Jill for this, because I must admit that there are times when I was sort of regretting taking this on, because it's such a huge subject, one that many of you will have your own thoughts about. And I'm worried that there might be a little bit of a bait and switch here in terms of my focus on Middle Eastern oil. So my focus really is going to be asking questions about where is this oil sourced from? And what kind of observations and conclusions can we draw about that? So hopefully, though, I'll say it in a sort of interesting enough way, or stress some of the significance that we can have an important discussion on it. Jill will come back to me and say, wait a minute, you're the one putting this course together in the history department next year. Which is true, but that wasn't my idea either. That idea is my friend and colleague's John Lutz. And as Jill said, John will be here next week to talk about next month. Thank you. Next month to talk about more about the domestic consumption of oil. So it might, and in particular, the V6 and V8 engines and things of that sort. So I think the two may go very well. In fact, let me tell you that they do go very well, so that you can keep all your questions about oil consumption for next month. Okay. So as you well know, I mean, the Middle East does source much of the oil, and has done for the last 50, 60 years in particular. So I'll be focusing particular on the Middle East context of oil, and in particular the oceans of it that lie under territories, particularly those bordering the Persian Gulf here. And so on the map here, we have the oil wells all designated by these, metal pyramids here. If there's one story, if there's one issue that I hope you leave here with, it is that, and here I'll pause for dramatic effect, oil is a liquid. So maybe I should have gone next to December and the drinking bit. Oil is a liquid. Now, I know that might sound very obvious, but much flows from that, and in ways that we need to be very, very conscious of. If we think about the oil and the oceans of it that lie very close to the surface in the Middle East, the surface of geographies that are very, very close to the coastline as well, then we think of I'm not a geologist, but we can think of natural processes that push this oil up to the surface with some help with the pumping, and then in pipelines, naturally by themselves, as it were, can then flow towards the ports, where they can then get put onto these big tankers. And once they're on these tankers, they can go out to anywhere in the world. And apparently, my understanding is that once these tankers leave the ports around Kuwait and along the coastline here, once they get through the Straits of Hormuz, they may change directions multiple times while en route. So what I've just described to you here in terms of the export of oil is extremely important. Now, when I talked about putting this course together with John Lutz, Jill's idea was, well, maybe you could start thinking a little bit about what that would look like. And so what I'm going to share with you is a sort of reading list that I'd like to put together for the courses. And the students will start with a fascinating book that came out maybe 10 years ago now called Carbon Democracy by Timothy Mitchell, Political Power in the Age of Oil. And to stress the significance of oil as a liquid, what Tim Mitchell does is asks you to consider the significance of previous carbon fuels when they're in the form of carbon. And so until the early 20th century, because most of the kind of carbon fuel came in the form of coal, very different properties than oil, much can be, I won't go into great detail about this, but when he talks about the properties of coal, the concentrations of these coal mines near industrialized areas, he suggests that the whole energy system had dramatic impact on the democratic processes that evolved from it for the larger society. He suggested that the coal miners, the railway workers, the dock workers were all part of an energy system that gave these workers, gave labor tremendous amount of capacity to disrupt energy in a way that made their voices matter, that they had to be listened to. And from this came an increasing democratization of society. They just had this opportunity to disrupt it in the form of a general strike. Carbon was that much more vulnerable to the political rulers than the system of oil that I just described. Now, there's different ways of telling this story, and normally it's not around a focus on the properties of oil as a liquid. One of the most famous and perhaps most traditional ways of telling the oil story in the Middle East is through Daniel Yergin's best-selling book, blockbuster book, The Prize, codenamed, subtitled The Epic Quest for Oil, Money, and Power. And here's the focus on these heroic geologists who are out in these adverse conditions, finding this oil, and then being able to develop it for modern society. So he really focuses on individuals like this. This is a photograph taken from the middle of the book with the caption, "After years of drudgery and disappointment, the engineer George Reynolds finally discovers oil in Persia, opening up oil development in the Middle East." Tim Mitchell says, look, if you're only going to focus on the money and the revenue, you're looking in the wrong place for what really matters about understanding oil in the Middle East. He says that it wasn't really about opening up the Middle East for the development of oil. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about the prize so much in terms of gaining wealth. It wasn't about markets and opening up markets. He says what the exploration for oil was really about was it was very much driven by just a few oil companies. Sometimes these oil companies are referred to as the Seven Sisters. Really, there were just 7 oil companies who controlled most of the development of the Middle East. These 7 sisters are, I had to write this down because I no way I was going to remember that, because the names change, right? They start as Standard Oil New York, Standard Oil New Jersey, and then they change names. But I think to be simple about it, we've got British Petroleum, which was Anglo-Iranian in the time that we're talking, the Anglo-Dutch company Shell, and then these 5 oil companies in the United States, Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, Texaco, Gulf. But there's some movement amongst them. But these 7 companies pretty much controlled everything. And the reason that they sought to control the development of the Middle East was not to open it up for oil development and the riches that came. It was to prevent the oil development in the Middle East. What they were interested in here was scarcity, because they were worried that because of oil and how quickly it was able to get out onto the market, that it would depress the price of oil. And they were also worried about the vulnerability of coal, and they were worried about the loss of control over it. So the fact that you had this oil in liquid form, and they knew about it in the Middle East, the companies wanted to control all those vulnerabilities. And they wanted to control a lot of those vulnerabilities by preventing them from happening. So if we go back to that earlier slide of pumps and pipelines and ports and then the tankers, right? The places where the oil is being produced are far, far from the places where it's being consumed. Something very different from the energy system under coal, which was going to provide all those workers with those capacities to disrupt. Right? So where you drilled for oil and where you refined the oil, and then out on sea. And many of these tankers might have been flagged under Panama or something, so they don't even come under regulations. There just wasn't the opportunities. There were at times opportunities for workers to strike, but they didn't have the opportunity to close it all down and make a big difference. And the companies wanted all that control in the first place. And one reason they were able to get all that control is because they worked very, very closely with the imperial powers of the time, particularly Britain coming out of World War I, but then coming out of World War II, the United States. And there's this interesting coincidence happening here. I think it's coincidence, but they may be more closely related than I've given thought to. But coming out of World War I and the dissolution of the and the collapse and the defeat of the Ottoman Empire after 4 years of fighting in the course of World War I, Britain was in a position of expanding its empire. And the way they always wanted to do that in this region and large parts of the world was as cheaply as possible. And so you found local leaders through whom you could rule indirectly. And it was at this time where these local families, the Sabah family in Kuwait, or the Al Thani family in Qatar, the Saud family in Saudi Arabia, etc., were able to be recognized as local leaders in these maps that Europe was drawing, Britain and France in particular. And then through relations with these indirect rulers, through these families, they were able to ensure that very favorable concession agreements were then written with those 7 companies. So I put up a map here on the coronation of Iraq's King Faisal, because I kind of like this photo because I think King Faisal looks a little awkward here. He looks a little vulnerable, and you've got surrounded by British representations. I think there's a bagpipe playing for his coronation, right? King Faisal actually was imported. He was sort of parachuted in. So those vulnerabilities as a leader were made very clear to him from the beginning, that he was only there because the British put him there. So Britain creates Iraq, and then they create a constitutional monarchy for Iraq, and then they import this vulnerable leader. He didn't have a lot of leverage, right, when it came time to signing an oil concession with these 7 sisters. And you see this up and down the coast here with the different families, as well as the Shah of Iran, and we'll spend a bit of time talking about that as well. So 2 very important elements here around that oil story. This epic quest for the prize was actually really about control over markets, control over prices, and ensuring scarcity. Now, to spend a little bit more time talking about these oil concessions, and most of them are either written up in the 1920s for Iraq and Iran, and the 1930s, a series of concessions are drawn up with the ruling families of Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, the Trucial States, Oman, and Saudi Arabia. These are families that are coming to control what are thought of in what become thought of as states in the interwar period. But the resources through which are coming through these concession agreements in terms of encouraging them to sign oil, in terms of authorizing, legitimizing the rights of the concessionaries. Okay, so a few major points here. That most of the concessions are shared between small numbers of oil companies. So in many cases, a consortium of different oil companies come together to form the Iraqi Petroleum Company, say, and then sign the contract with poor King Faisal, right, who was forced to do it by the British government. Now, they're doing this because really the companies, they don't want another company to come and undersell them. So different companies are involved in the same consortium. It's like they're trying to keep an eye on each other to not bring the price down. So they're in it together here, right? They're operating as a cartel here. Right. So when we think of OPEC, which we will in a few moments, they then basically pick up the role that the 7 sisters were playing in many ways. What these concessions did is you had leaders, I suppose, you could argue, I think some have, that some of these leaders did pretty well in terms of eking out what they could from the concessions, given the fact that they didn't have the expertise to get the oil out onto the market, and they had very little leverage, especially in terms of the British Imperial officer who is working behind their back. But these concessions would provide the companies with the exclusive right to explore for oil and the right to contract workers, to build infrastructure, to sign their own deals with local security groups, bedroom groups, etc. And most of these powers were, again, to limit production. So consider that oil is discovered around 1908, just before World War I. These concessions are signed in 1920s, 1930s. No serious oil revenue comes until the 1950s. Right. Because these oil companies they're the same oil companies with rights to Mexico and Venezuela and the United States itself. Right? So they didn't. They wanted the price point was something they manufactured. There was nothing determined by the market. It had no direct relation to something called supply and demand. It had to be high enough to ensure their profits, but low enough, right, that they weren't going to get any grief from government. Of course, many of the CEOs were part of the American government at that time, so it could be kind of quite closely negotiated that way. Keeping supplies scarce enough for profits to thrive. And in return, the company paid a standard royalty per ton of oil produced, which wasn't that big a deal if there's no oil being produced, right? Plus a lump sum. So some of those lump sums actually proved to be more important in the negotiating process than the royalties, because they had no control over how much oil would be. They didn't even have control over where or when something would be explored. All of that was signed off to the concession. One point to make here about the lump sum is, so for example, in Saudi Arabia, Ibn Saud got a little frustrated with the fact that no oil was being developed, and so Britain was paying these lump sums in lieu of it, but they kind of ran out of money, and my understanding is the opportunity the United States looked to, and then they came on board to start providing these sums to Ibn Saud. They basically brought him into the World War II Lend-Lease program as a way to keep him now as part of the American camp as he moved out of sort of the British sphere. And those lump sums were actually advances against future royalties. So it wasn't, you know. Okay, so let's take a quick case study here. So of Iran, and this is a story many of you will know. But in the 1950s, when this is British Petrol, Anglo-Iranian has the concession in particularly in southern Iran around Abadan, and in the early 1950s, by the late 1940s, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, later BP, a major shareholder of that company is the British government. Okay, so they're paying dividends to the British government. Just to give you a sense of how inequitable this concession was working out. The profits, how to put this? The company was making huge profits and paying taxes to the British government on those profits. Oh, sorry. That was me. Could you please all turn off your telephones? So they're paying taxes on those profits to the British government, keeping in mind that they're already paying dividends to the British government, right? So British government's getting profits, and they're getting taxes on those profits. And the taxes on the profits are greater than the royalties that Iran is getting. The taxes on the profits are greater than the royalties that Iran is. Okay. So in 1950, you have a prime minister who's given a certain amount of authority, a certain amount of discretion in the parliament at this time, because coming out of World War II, the country was occupied by the by the British and the Russians in order to turn over the infrastructure to the American war effort supplying Russia. So this weakened the monarchical arrangements that had already been set up in Iran, weakened the Shah enough to allow for the parliament a bit more action, a bit more discretion. And the prime minister, Mossadegh, the popularly elected prime minister, seeks to nationalize the oil industry, which is perfectly legal at this time, and you have other nationalizations happening around this time. But it's legal. You have to, compensate shareholders and commit to other arrangements. But BP basically tells the other sisters that they will actually sue those other oil companies if anybody else picks up a barrel of Iranian oil, because they say that's our oil, that it'll be theft, as it were. Now, the Seven Sisters probably didn't need their arms twisted, because, of course, they were probably a bit anxious about other nationalizations. But the point is that for 2 or 3 years, no Iranian oil gets put out onto the market. They just have no revenue coming in. And that makes it fairly straightforward for the British intelligence and the CIA to come in 1953 and pretty much topple Mossadegh and then bring back the Shah and empower him to rule Iran with much more a brutal authority from 53 to 1979. Okay, now that's still my friend. Okay, so what's going on here in terms of, that was kind of the peak of the Seven Sisters control in the 1950s, because many people are certain in the companies themselves as well as governments realizing that a more equitable power sharing relationship is going to have to happen here. So since in the 1960s, you do have quite a massive transfer of wealth from those concessions, from those countries to the oil producing countries. So I thought we could just kind of go through this a little gradually, because there's some interesting aspects to it that aren't always understood. Part of it is that the countries themselves are developing a bit of expertise, a bit of understanding about how to organize their own oil company. So they're actually able to, they have a bit more leverage in that regard. They still need the companies, they're still signing agreements, but they have a little bit more, they're coming at it from a more informed position. And then Libya. This country of Libya plays a really important role. The 1967 war closes down the Suez Canal. And with the closure of the Suez Canal, you don't have the same access by Europe to those tankers coming out of the Straits of Hormuz. At about that time, you have a radical kind of revolutionary government under Muammar Gaddafi coming to power. And they can learn from the experience of the other oil-producing countries. And what they do is they, rather than making a deal with one of those Seven Sisters, they find some smaller European oil companies that don't have the same leverage. There's still massive profits to be made here, and they sign much better terms with those smaller oil companies. So they keep the bigger seven ones out. They lose that kind of power of a cartel, and they're prepared to pay higher prices. Those smaller companies, they don't have contracts elsewhere in the world. They're highly reliant on Libya's. Libya is right there on the shore of Europe. Their oil actually has a kind of a lower sulfur content. So as environmental concerns become more pressing, it's more desirable oil. But it's available. And there's still big profits to be made by the oil companies, even though Libya has negotiated much better terms, both higher royalties, but also better ownership opportunities and the ability to tax these companies themselves. So that's starting to change, because as soon as Libya is doing this, countries like Iran and Saudi are going to start thinking, well, what about us? And then when the 1973 war happens and Arab countries impose what's often referred to as an oil embargo against the United States to pressure it to get involved in an Arab-Israeli peace process and bring about an end to the conflict there, what they do is they threaten a 5% decrease in exports to America and countries in Europe every month until America engages in bringing about a peace between Israelis and Palestinians. Okay, now, this is an interesting story. It's not one that I understand particularly well, but it does shed some light on some interesting issues of the oil. Rather than thinking of this as a sort of a boycott, or really in terms of an embargo, in fact, there was plenty of oil still in the global economy. It wasn't as though there's a kind of a supply and demand issue here, where they were curtailing the supply and thus demand going in. There was panic. There was, markets were reacting to a very kind of uncertain position, but there was enough oil out there. Other countries were going to make up the difference. Iran, for example, started increasing its exportation, although the Arab countries, some Arab countries were engaged in an embargo, and they weren't even all that coordinated about this. I think Iraq was saying, well, we'll do America, but not Europe, and things of this sort. So Iran just started taking offers, and the price kept going up. So this is really interesting story about how in combination with the changes that had been happening since 1967, the 1973 oil embargo upsets the way that the pricing had happened until this point in ways that are more favorable to the oil-producing countries. OPEC basically gets involved here now. OPEC had been created 10 years earlier, or 13 years earlier in 1960, but here it actually, the oil producing, sorry, that's not right, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries that had been formed in 1960, they come together after the 1973 war, and they determine a new price at which oil would be. They agree on $12 a barrel. Now, before you say, well, wait a minute, isn't that, a gross manipulation of market prices? Keep in mind that there was no market price of oil because the Seven Sisters had pretty much maintained oil at $2 a barrel from the 50s and the 60s. Okay. So in many ways, you could argue that, I think some have argued that the $12 was probably closer to what might have been a market price than the $2. At this point, too, oil companies were kind of pleased to have because this means a huge rise in their profits, too. And this has happened at a time when the oil companies were actually quite eager to open up new energy sources that were going to be much more expensive than oil, things like Alaska and offshore sea resources and things of this sort. So it's something that the oil companies are appreciative of in terms of the heightened prices at this point. And now OPEC basically has taken that job of cartel in terms of keeping a price, or at least maintaining that kind of idea of scarcity, not putting too much oil onto the market. OPEC's not particularly good at this, I don't think. The key here is Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has this capacity to be what they call a swing producer. So they're the ones with a certain amount of capacity to either cut back if needed or increase their supplies if needed. That doesn't always work to their favor. I don't think they're always happy about that, and sometimes they kind of go their own way. Today, we talk about OPEC Plus, which is basically Saudi Arabia and Russia having that kind of, or at least over the last few years, that kind of control over the market, that they can set prices. Okay. Okay, so what about everyday life? Okay, so I appreciate what Jill is doing here with this theme of everyday life. I wanted to put a bit different spin on it, though, and ask, well, what does all this mean for everyday life in the Middle East? And so I thought there was sort of three different ways we could look at this, right? And again, thinking about three different authors that I would like my students to read. One group would be these nomadic groups in Arabia in the 1930s who would have confronted these early engineers and all the expertise and changes that they brought with them. I'll talk about that in a second. And then if we were to shift to, say, the grandchildren of that generation and enjoying being able to enjoy the rapid influx of revenues to countries like Kuwait. Kuwait begins this process in the 50s and 60s, and then look at what everyday life looked at in these oil producing countries when that wealth did start to flow in. And then, because it's been in the news so much, I think to talk a little bit about migrant workers in the Gulf. Migrant workers have always been a feature of this story. The British and the Americans, they brought in migrant workers right from the beginning, to the extent that there was labor to be, again, to say this is not an industry that was so reliant on labor as was coal. That was part of the attraction of these oil companies moving to oil from coal and these countries themselves. But right from the beginning, they relied on migrant labor in part because, and a highly spatialized and racialized version of migrant labor, in part because it gave these companies tremendous control over. Migrant workers were going to be much less likely to engage in labor action if they knew that they could be deported at any point. So I just note that here, because when we think about the migrant and labor situation in the Gulf countries today, especially given the attention that was quite rightly given to it during the World Cup in Qatar last year, keep in mind that this is an older system that the British and the Americans first brought in. Now, there's a wonderful novel by a Saudi novelist who lived in Jordan. It's banned in Saudi Arabia, called Cities of Salt. It's if I could recommend a particular source to to try to understand the disruptions that must have been experienced on the ground in everyday life in an area that's not named as such, but it would have been an area around Dhahran, one of the first Aramco concessions. it does quite a wonderful job evoking the disruptions to this fictional valley when these strange people come with their strange machines and their strange instruments, right? And then pretty much destroy this valley. They say they're looking for water, but they're looking for oil. Some of these reflections will be well understood by indigenous populations around the world, but he talks in kind of terms such as this one local leader, Mitab, he flinched every time the Americans pointed back in his direction, thinking at first they were pointed at him. And then he realized they were pointing instead to the land he was walking on. He was no more than a landmark to them. They didn't care about the people living there. They didn't care about that lived reality. The local sheikh, right, or the local leader didn't care about them because he was thinking about those lump sum payments that the companies that were hiring those geologists and those workers were also paying to him. So you see the complete disruption of an older way of life that's lost. Moving ahead to their great-grandchildren. So what's going on when all of a sudden this money does start pouring in, right? When this money does start pouring in, Kuwait is one of the first countries to benefit from the transfer of wealth. And they're one of the first countries to start asking this question, well, what do we do with this wealth? And of course, that can actually be a very problematic question. Right? I'm not an economist, but many of us will understand things like the Dutch disease, right? It's quite problematic to an economy when all of these foreign reserves come into that economy and have to be spent in a way that doesn't disrupt local manufacturing or doesn't disrupt local economies. What Kuwait decides to do, understandably enough, is very first off the bat, they start to invest a lot into the infrastructure. And that's everything from water systems to roads to schools. But then you start to think that in terms of domestic infrastructure. But then Kuwait's not a very big place, right? And there's not a very large population. So it sort of saturates that local investment market. So very early on, actually, Kuwait starts to invest internationally. They start to invest, I think, in Mercedes and in various European countries. They invest a lot in real estate and West Kensington or something of this sort. And that makes them actually, that'll bring opportunities and challenges. When, of course, Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait in 1990, looking for that golden goose of Kuwaiti oil reserves, right? You could argue that the Sabah family did well to have a huge external source of investment. Jill Crystal says that it's actually sometime in the 80s that Kuwait started earning more money from its foreign investments than it did from oil. Hence, Kuwait was always a problematic OPEC partner because it didn't really worry about the price of oil. It just wanted to get the oil out there because it was already making so much money on its foreign investments. Having said that, though, right, that also makes the Sabah family quite vulnerable to another kind of narrative around oil. And that is a narrative in the Arab world, particularly in a moment of Arab nationalism under, say, the leadership of Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, which started to look at oil not so much as just a Sabah resource or a Saud resource, but thought of oil as an Arab resource. And many of those workers coming into these economies were coming from other parts of the Arab world. And those remittances being sent back to those countries were extremely important for those families. So there are different ways in which these oil economies are being linked in a regional way, but also there's a sort of political narrative around the extent to which the oil resource ought to be spent in a way that should benefit the Arab people. So as illegal, a violation of international laws, as was Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait in 1990, he actually could tap into quite a rich stream narrative when he said, when he accused the Sabah family, of investing in West Kensington and not the West Bank or something of that sort. So it actually did also hold that family to standards and stories that made it quite vulnerable at the same time. In the early 90s, the Sabah family, when it was returned to power after the George Bush coalition to reverse Saddam Hussein's occupation, they actually did start to engage in more, at least briefly, more consultative processes. Now, they hadn't really engaged in very many consultative processes because the other thing that they spent all their money on was just flooding the population with gifts and entitlements. They built a very generous social welfare state in Kuwait. a process which Jill Crystal refers to as reverse taxation. So not only were there no taxes, but there was a very generous allotment of entitlements, social welfare programs, right? Free education, promise of jobs, promise of housing, promise of all these promises. Now, when we bring this story, if we're to kind of connect it a little bit back to the story that Tim Mitchell was telling us about the link between carbon fuels and democracy, there's an interesting angle to that here. To the extent that democracy in the United States, right, had a kind of that Boston Tea Party origins to it, no taxation without representation, right? In a way, that's what Sabah family's saying. Yeah, no taxation, no representation. I'm being a bit glib about that, right? Because there's much more to it. But I think one can reverse it. That if these oil exporting countries are in a position where the oil does run out and they will have to rely more on taxing their population, they'll likely have to be that much more accountable to them. Yeah. It also, of course, raises this whole question of citizenship rights, right? Because you have to be very clear if Kuwaiti citizens, and keep in mind, Kuwait is only kind of emerging as an independent state through the process by which, after World War I, Britain starts making these relationships through this family, the Sabah family, at this place that they're interested in because of the oil underneath there, right? Then, so there's no such thing as Kuwait, right? But now, as it's emerged, then you have to think, well, what is a Kuwaiti? Who is a citizen of Kuwait? So they're fairly strict about it. They pick a date or something, and anybody who had an ancestor in Kuwait at that time is a Kuwaiti citizen. And if you didn't, then you're not a citizen, and then you don't benefit from these this system of entitlements. Which kind of brings us to my my last point, or my last sort of reading, as it were. This is and one could go with a lot of human rights organizations' reports as well, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International. This was a report written a couple decades ago by Roger Owen called Migrant Workers in the Gulf. It was updated again in the 1990s, right? But I think this is an extremely important story to be told about the oil industry as well. The fact that from the beginning it has always been dependent upon a racialized hierarchy and spatialized hierarchy of foreign workers, right? And the extent to which everyday life for these workers has been extraordinarily vulnerable. They've been extraordinarily vulnerable. The reason for this is that the system that the British put in place and that has been maintained by the royal families of these states since then is called a sponsorship system, or kafala in Arabic. And what the families have done is they give permits to companies and to individuals to sponsor labor migrants to come to these countries. And of course, if you're Kuwait, right from the 50s, 60s, if there's a whole system of entitlements which is paying for you, then there's nobody in Kuwait who's prepared to take up many of these service-oriented jobs, right? Ranging from anywhere from house cleaning to daycare to street cleaning to many of these jobs. So they're very, very reliant on a system of sponsorship. This all came really under a lot of the spotlight when Qatar they won the right to host FIFA 2022. They won that some 10 years ago, and in the meantime, human rights organizations have used that opportunity to shine a light on the kafala system and on the situation of migrant workers, revealing that often these migrant workers, they would lose their passport upon entry. The sponsor, an individual or a company, sometimes working through a recruitment firm which had its own shady deals going on, right, which would sometimes charge these workers a certain amount to even kind of have access to these economies. And then upon entering the economy, they would lose their passport and then be subject kind of to the whims of their sponsor. So all of which fell outside of the labor laws of these countries. So all sorts of abuses would take place, including sort of physical abuse of a lot of domestic workers, to the non-payment of wages, the inability of anybody to switch jobs, the threat of being deported at any moment, and then the labor conditions, having to build these stadiums, for example, in Qatar, under terrible conditions in terms of heat, and having no recourse to sort of any kind of workers' insurance were something to go wrong. That's on the workplace, and then the places where they lived, these were also terrible as well. In terms of Qatar, an argument I think can be made that the Qatar government responded to this by changing the kafala system and asserting better rights for these workers, increasing minimum wage, increasing kind of worker conditions, etc. The big question, of course, becomes, did those reforms go far enough? And now, without the international gaze upon them, now that the FIFA has run its course, will they be maintained? Right? And this is just Qatar, let alone what's happening in other economies. So much still to be done there. Keep in mind, of course, too, that for the countries mostly in South Asia, which are from which many of these workers do look for jobs, they're still well sought after. Right, for many of these families who go to Oman or Bahrain, they're able to make more money there despite these conditions that to allow them to send the remittances home and make a difference for them back at home. Okay. That doesn't mean they can bring their family there. It doesn't mean that they're, okay. Okay, I think this kind of brings me to an end. I hope there's enough material out there to talk about, both in terms of the imperial history of oil and the everyday some of the lives lived. There are, of course, so many ways to tell the story of oil. I'm sort of looking at Middle East oil, but even there's so many ways to tell the story of Middle East oil, and I've sort of just chosen my own route. Before, though, I do want to note that I have the privilege of, I hope, punting the really tough questions about consumption of oil today here in the West Coast and Victoria next week, or to next month, to John Lutz, who will be talking about, I made this title up. I put oil, the automobile, just to kind of link it to this one. But he will be talking about the car, which has its own story to be told in terms of, if we think about the high demand for oil in the United States in the 60s, some of which manufactured through a consumer, through a society, that contributes its own scarcity issue, right, in terms of higher demand for oil. And some of that can be, I think, understood as being manufactured by government and companies as well. So thank you very, very much. Yes, I'm happy to field some questions. So Jill said, try to keep it to 40 minutes. So we have lots of time for questions and observations, clarifications. Yes, please, Nikki. Sorry, and then Andrea. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Right. So the question was around more of the environmental impact on the Middle East. Thank you for that. And then the vivid memories that many people have of when Saddam Hussein leaves, or is forced out of Kuwait. He adopts something of a scorched earth policy, and he lights these Kuwaiti wells on fire and causes just a tremendous environmental disaster that takes, I think, months. I mean, when a well is on fire like this, it takes a long time. I think Canada actually sent some firefighters out there to try to control those well fires. It takes a long time to put those fires out, and in the meantime, they're just spewing oil into the Gulf area and into the coastal plains areas. So. So a lot of things we can say here. So to the extent that the Middle East is responsible for, to the extent that it's responsible for the production of carbon fuels, and the extent to which carbon fuels are responsible for catastrophic climate change, the Middle East is also probably the most it is one of, if not the most vulnerable area of climate change in terms of extreme heat conditions and in terms of water scarcity. So there's a real problem here in terms of trying to kind of manage those, and of course the oil producers are also the ones with the money that might have some of the environmental solutions. But these are authoritarian monarchs who will have their own agendas in terms of investing in kind of clean energy. Many of those agendas will have to do with what's sometimes referred to as greenwashing, right? You kind of the extent to which, well, for heaven's sakes, Kuwait is hosting COP this year, right? Like, I know, he says as though that is just naturally kind of absurd. Well, Egypt hosted COP last year. I'm sure there's more complicated issues as to why they're able to host it, but or the stories around Qatar building stadiums that are air conditioned. Again, it's more complex to that, but air conditioning, we know, is one of the highest emitters of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Okay, so thank you for that. I don't have ways forward in terms of answering that, but it's so important to think about just how challenged these areas are. I was going to give you one or two more examples. These rivers, to the extent that there are river systems in the Middle East, and there's really just the Nile and then the Tigris-Euphrates system. Both of those river systems, before they hit the coast, it's very much a delta situation where, in terms of low-lying coastal areas. And in both cases, you have sort of what we otherwise think of as a Bangladesh situation, where it's at a higher sea rise, the higher sea levels combined with the deteriorating water quality is eroding these delta areas, which are otherwise some of the most densely populated areas and very important for agriculture as well. Okay, there's one other route I'm going to go with this, because I kind of skipped through it, I think, too quickly. And that is, my understanding is one of the worst polluters, in the world are militaries. Right? They have huge carbon footprint. And then when you think about the damage done by wars, I know I'm generalizing a tremendous amount, right? But they too have just a tremendous impact on the environment in terms of the destruction of forests or the chemicals that are left behind, dams that are being held sort of hostage by different militant groups. So we're also looking at a part of the world that has been especially destabilized over the last couple of decades. And here's an important point that Tim Mitchell draws attention to in terms of the transfer of wealth to Middle Eastern countries in the 1970s. Essentially what happens is the United States what essentially happens with the transfer of wealth, of oil wealth, of all the money going to the oil-producing states, there's kind of a convenient recycling of those petrodollars as these authoritarian monarchs now buy increasingly large numbers of arms from the United States. So you see a nice kind of recycling of all of that money as Saudi Arabia sells to, or Kuwait or Qatar, to the United States or to Canada, right? There's that massive $15 billion arms sale a few years ago. And in return, right, the money, the arms go back there, okay. And where does it get these countries? Okay, so Iran was in the 1970s selling all of this oil at with higher revenues, and then importing massive amounts of American weapons. And then in 1979, the revolution brings popular protests on the street, bring the whole regime down from within. Saddam Hussein then seeks to take advantage of that power vacuum in Iran to move a border. You then have an 8-year war unfold between Iran and Iraq, a war that probably would have come to an end much, much sooner had they not been oil producers and had not the international arms community been more than happy to supply and flood it with weapons, right? So, and at one point, the United States is selling weapons to both sides, right? Iran-Contra and all of that. And the Sabah family, all of that money that they then spent on weapons, and Saddam Hussein invades in 1990, they can't protect themselves. Saudi Arabia is feeling that much threatened by it, and they bring the United States in. So despite the billions, tens and hundreds of billions of dollars in weapons purchases from the United States. Right? Still, they're not in a position to protect themselves. But of course, there's more going on with all of that, because that money is greasing the relations with the United States. It's greasing relations within, because some of these princes that might be rivals for power are given the commissions or given the responsibilities to negotiate those arms purchases and pocketing lots of commissions at the same time. So there's more going on with all those military purchases, but the extent to which it's all making the whole, it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy if all of this makes it more unstable, but the instability is something that which allows for more arms purchases. Yeah. So the link there, though, Nikki, was really around the military impact on the environment. Can I think Andrea had her hand up too. Sorry, and then I'll come over here. Okay, thank you. Was it a nice soft one, though? Was it? Okay, Shahid. Oh, sorry. Yeah. You go first. Thank you.
Oh, is there any refining capacity at all in these countries?
So the question was around the refining capacity. So for decades, there wasn't. So in the 1920s, 1930s, Iraq was desperate for their own refinery, but Britain made sure, or the IPC made sure, that the refinery was out on the Mediterranean coast, a pipeline away. And so that was good. Then they've slowly built up the refining capacity, but still it's interesting that there is so little refining capacity in many of these countries. So many of them, you have these situations where they're in fact importing refined oil and exporting. Yeah.
Surprised me after what you told us earlier.
Yeah. Sorry, Shahid, and then Larry.
Thank you, Dr. Bunton. You never talked about the Eastern Mediterranean gas.
Oh, the contemporary, the gas in the Mediterranean. Yep.
And there was one other little thing I just wanted to say. When you talk about the armed weapons, the suspicion I've always had is that the weapons they sell were never intended to be used.
No, I think that's right. Yeah. No, that's a good point. Sorry, so a point around gas in the Eastern Mediterranean, which I had an opportunity to skip that by just saying there's a question about the weapons, that some of these, I think oftentimes the weapons were not even expected to be used, right? This is, a couple of years ago, Trump had this press conference with some Saudi leaders, and he boasted about the hundreds of billions of dollars of weapons sales. I don't know if you remember this, right? And he did it in actually kind of an insulting way, I think. So look how I'm scamming these people out of their money, right? And to draw an attention to the fact that some of these sales are really about kind of a checkbook diplomacy more than they necessarily are about using these weapons. I didn't really talk a lot about gas, and so you've got a country like Qatar right now is really dependent upon its gas field and the investments they made in the 1990s. They ran out of their oil production, dropped much more quickly than other Gulf powers. But it's an it's a gas field that they liquefied natural gas field that was a gas field that then they have invested in the technology to liquefy it and then export it, that they share with Iran. So Qatar and Iran have always actually got on okay, much to the chagrin of Saudi Arabia, and took it out on Qatar for a few years. And then in the Eastern Mediterranean, the discovery of natural gas fields in the Eastern Mediterranean are really shaking up the energy market also, because you have countries like Israel and Egypt and Lebanon, Gaza, who knows, will they have access to these big gas fields? But I think even more to the point is now the pipelines. So every country is interested in how to get this gas to Europe. And so what becomes really important there is where will these pipelines go and how do they access that? So another interesting story here is Turkey trying to improve relations with the government, one of the governments in Libya, so that if their offshore rights can connect, then they can block not just other explorers, but they can block the pipelines and the energy routes. And that's another big question in all of this, is the routes by which that energy gets out. Larry, did you ever?
talked about
Oh.
how the oil industry had basically infiltrated so many aspects of civil society, universities, think tanks, etc., in Alberta.
Hmm.
But and in doing so had basically kind of essentially contained or almost nullified democratic procedure and process. And so
Yeah.
I was fascinated to hear Tim Mitchell's description of fossil fuels as a democratic engine at one point. To what extent has oil actually reversed that?
Right. That's the second. Yeah.
Alberta, of course, but in
Yeah. So that. I haven't done Tim Mitchell's work justice here. It's really it's one of these books that has so many ideas coming out of it, right? And some of them will drive people nuts. I mean, it's such an ambitious work, and it's quite incredible to me that he just keeps pushing, and he's not afraid to just follow these routes, these networks, and explore further and further. I'd be just too intimidated to draw all these connections. But he does that, and his first sentence, Larry, I think is exactly what you're saying. Fossil fuels helped create both the possibility of modern democracy, carbon, and its limits, oil. And so that second part of the book talks about how oil has actually stilted democracy in the United States, but also I picked it up in terms of understanding. I took the story to the Middle East, but he keeps much of that story in the United States.
I have the organizer's prerogative of the last question.
Yeah, of course.
I'm wondering if I can push you to tell us a bit of prophesizing. So, as
You're a fellow historian asking me to look into the future.
if I get those questions, you get those.
Yeah.
So as we're thinking about climate change and we're thinking about moving away from fossil fuels, I'm wondering if you can tell us what you think the role of the Middle East in that is going to be.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned something about investing in green energies or alternatives, but also I'm just wondering what you think the fallout is going to be.
Yeah. No idea, but I'm not alone, right? I'm not alone. So in the blurb that I sent very quickly to Jill about 3 weeks ago, right, I sort of talked about us possibly being at a moment of seeing the end of oil. And I the day before, I'd read an article in the Financial Times, which had talked about peak oil coming, that we're near it in the next 5 or 10 years. That doesn't mean that oil is exhausted or stopped. It means that the rate of increase, that it won't continue to increase. It could plateau for a while. It could sharply fall. It could kind of go up and down but for many reasons, part of it being the depletion of oil fields, part of it being the rather, I think, remarkable rise of alternative cleaner energies like solar and wind over the last 10 years, the move of cars to of course that brings all sorts of other problems with batteries and everything else, but that idea of peak oil, right? Now, I've been studying the Middle East for 30 years, and I think for 30 years I've been reading about peak oil, right? So it's one of those things, and many of you will know this better than I do. So it's just a difficult thing because it all kind of depends on the pricing too, doesn't it, in terms of what the alternatives are. And there's still lots of oil there. But having read this, then there was an article, letter to the editor that you could click on from a consultant of Middle Eastern oil companies railing against this, right? This whole idea saying, there's no such thing as peak oil, but I think did it so from a position of real concern that in the Financial Times might actually discourage continued investment in the oil fields. And so they obviously had their own agenda in this. But what you do see is continued investment in Middle Eastern oil. Is that because they believe that there's a role for oil to play in an energy transition in terms of perhaps using that money to invest in solar or other alternatives? Or is it perhaps because they realize that the end is nigh and they just want to get as much of that out while they can? I'm not quite sure, but you do certainly see a lot of concerns in these countries, Saudi Arabia in particular, to shift out of a reliance on oil, to diversify their economy. There's that, but also to shift towards maybe being a leader in energy alternatives. Interesting, that will all, so far I think, that's actually increased the relations between countries like Saudi Arabia and China, because China has some of the, it has been most, I think, generous with some of its solar technologies, yeah. One of the problems I think with solar is it's not a liquid. You can't move it on tankers, right, wherever you want it to go, that energy. So it'll be interesting to see how that all becomes part of a grid, yeah. But
Sorry, I know you gave it the last question, but I'm your student. If we are at peak oil, it has declined.
yeah.
What happens to the monarchies? Do they become abandoned assets?
Yeah, okay, and that's a nice way to wrap up, right? So if in fact if these countries cannot rely on this flow of, economists often talk about rents as being these ridiculous profits, right? So you can maybe think of an oil field as generating a reasonable profit, but because of luck, just because of where this resource is, right? It costs, I don't know, if it costs $4 to $5 to produce a barrel of oil here, it costs, somebody correct me, 30 to 40 minimum in Alberta or something of that sort. It's not to create whatever they are from. So that's huge profits, right? When in terms of what the price of oil is, and that's all going into directly to the families. So I think it's reasonable to assume that if they're not able to have that access to a foreign source, if they're going to be more reliant upon their own populations for taxation revenue, that those populations will expect a greater say in their governance. Whether or not they'll get it, though, I mean, because a lot of that investment is also going into, weapons, but also cyber technology and surveillance and everything else that's making it that much, perhaps giving these governments that much more power to maintain themselves in control. So when the Arab Spring, so-called Arab Spring, broke out 2011, it did just occur to me that I think it's the 50th anniversary of the 1973 oil embargo, right? October 1970. So it was 12 years ago or so that the Arab Spring. Of course, it didn't really hit these these oil-producing economies, because countries like Saudi Arabia, then they saw, as populations were learning from Tunisia to Egypt to Syria, et cetera, so too were governments. And within a month or two of Tunisia, the Tunisian demonstrations, Saudi Arabia just all of a sudden spent like $40 billion on new entitlements. Right? If they're not able to do that moving forward, how much more vulnerable might they be? Right? I wouldn't be too optimistic, though, because these countries are extremely authoritarian. They're extremely they have very brutal intelligence, security networks, etc., all of which is probably lying behind some of these negotiations that countries like the UAE and now Saudi Arabia are trying to arrange, either through China or through the United States. But nobody asked me about that, so, and we've run out of time. So again, thank you so much for this opportunity. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
I am much shorter than Martin. This is way up there. All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. And keep an eye in your mailboxes, your virtual mailboxes, for the announcement for the upcoming talk on the car. And bring your questions about that to that talk. I look forward to seeing you all. Thank you, and have a great evening. Bye-bye.